In the fall of 1823, deep within the thick forests of southeastern Ohio, a young woman was discovered wandering unclothed through the woods, her skin marked by intricate geometric scars that baffled medical professionals. Margaret Hayes, who was just 22 years old, had been absent for more than 3 months. Local hunters who found her heard her speaking in broken phrases regarding sessions and a chair fitted with leather restraints. 3 separate doctors, each a reputable practitioner in their own town, looked into her situation and subsequently withdrew from her care. The county magistrate classified the official documents, concealing them in archives that would remain untouched for almost 200 years. The nature of Margaret's affliction, as revealed to those physicians, was so horrifying that it prompted one of them, Dr. Edmund Cartwright, to allegedly destroy his records and depart from Ohio permanently. This evening, we will reveal the truth of Margaret's ordeal, a narrative that exposes the most sinister aspects of early American medical practice and the consequences of scientific ambition, devoid of ethical restraint. Before we proceed with the account of Margaret Hayes and the dreadful findings that caused 3 doctors to forsake their oath, I urge you to click subscribe if you have the courage to listen to stories many would prefer remain buried. These are not merely stories. They are pieces of genuine history that influential figures attempted to obliterate. Let me know in the comments which state you're listening from, and together we can form a community dedicated to uncovering the truth, however unsettling it may be. The mystery of Margaret's case starts in the summer of 1823, when she vanished from her small farming community near what is presently Athens County, Ohio. The Ohio frontier in 1823 was a severe environment where simply surviving often overshadowed the need for comfort, and the boundary between a settled society and the untamed wilds was perilously vague. Margaret Hayes resided with her widowed father, Thomas Hayes, on a humble farm roughly 12 miles south of Athens in a hamlet known to locals as Millfield. This community was home to around 40 families, primarily settlers from Pennsylvania and Virginia, who had come to the Ohio Territory, seeking affordable land and new opportunities. Throughout the settlement, Margaret was recognized as an exceptionally bright young woman. Her ability to read and write with significant fluency was unusual for a frontier woman of that era. Her father, an ex-school teacher who became a farmer, had provided her with an education that exceeded societal expectations for someone of her position. She maintained thorough journals about agricultural life, studied medical books loaned to her by the town's doctor, and exchanged letters with family in Pennsylvania that demonstrated a keen intellect and inquisitive nature. The Hayes family inhabited a log cabin constructed by Thomas himself, encircled by cultivated fields of corn, wheat, and vegetables. Their closest neighbors, the Brennans, were Irish immigrants who had arrived just 2 years prior and lived almost a mile away. Such solitude was characteristic of frontier living, but it also meant that in emergencies, assistance was distant and frequently arrived too late. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the settlement's sole physician, was a man in his 50s who had received his training in Philadelphia. Before relocating west in 1819, he was recognized for his meticulous medical methods and his practice of maintaining comprehensive notes on every case he handled. Dr. Hartwell had seen Margaret multiple times over the years for minor illnesses, a broken wrist at 16, a serious fever the next winter, and routine checkups that affirmed what was already obvious: she was well, smart, and unusually tough. The summer of 1823 proved especially challenging for the Hayes family. Thomas had hurt his back while planting in the spring, forcing Margaret to take on most of the farm labor. She handled it well, but those living nearby observed that she appeared more reclusive and exhausted. Mary Brennan, the Irish woman from the closest farm, later informed authorities that Margaret had ceased her visits in late June, which was odd given their established friendship despite their different origins. The especially alarming aspect of Margaret's disappearance was how sudden it was. On July 15, 1823, Thomas Hayes awoke to find his daughter's bed unoccupied and her personal items, including her valued journals, gone. The cabin showed no indications of a fight, no proof of a break-in, and no farewell message. Her father promptly gathered a search party, but after days of scouring the adjacent forests, they discovered no evidence of Margaret Hayes. The search was hindered by the dense woodland enclosing the settlement. The Ohio forest in 1823 was still, mostly primordial, a dense ceiling of oak, maple, and hickory trees casting a permanent shade below. Wolves and bears were frequently seen, and the endless labyrinth of trees, creeks, and gorges made it simple for anyone to become disoriented. After weeks with no news of Margaret, the community began to speculate about her fate. Some thought wild animals had taken her. Others suspected kidnapping by Native Americans. Despite no sightings in the area for more than a year, a handful proposed she had eloped with a man from a nearby settlement. But those close to her dismissed this, as Margaret had never indicated interest in marriage and often voiced satisfaction with her life in Millfield. The morning of October 23, 1823, was cold and gloomy, with an autumn fog that muted sounds and softened the world's edges. Two local hunters, James Fletcher and his adolescent son Robert, were pursuing deer roughly 8 miles northeast of Millfield when they heard what they first took for an injured animal. The noise was a deep, rhythmic groaning emanating from within the forest, nearing the source. The groaning clarified into something more disquieting, a human voice, speaking in a disjointed pattern. Words and phrases were reiterated incessantly, broken by pauses. Then, abrupt outbursts resembling frantic appeals. The Fletchers shared a concerned look. In 30 years of hunting these woods, James had never encountered anything similar. They discovered her in a small clearing a quarter-mile from Miller's Creek, a stream that flows into the Hocking River. Margaret Hayes was seated on the ground with her legs crossed, entirely nude, her long dark hair clumped and tangled around her shoulders. She rocked rhythmically, clutching her knees, speaking in a voice that was hers, yet altered flatter, more robotic. "The sessions must continue," she repeated. "The chair with leather straps. The observations are incomplete. The subject requires additional stimulus." She would then become quiet for about half a minute before starting again with minor changes. "The sessions must continue. The measurements are not yet precise. The subject shows promising reactions to the copper instruments." James Fletcher, a War of 1812 veteran, not easily unsettled, later informed Dr. Hartwell that the vision of Margaret Hayes was the most unnerving experience of his life. It wasn't only her nakedness or apparent insanity. It was her physical state. Even from several feet away, he could see her skin was covered in what looked like scars, but unlike any he had ever seen. They created geometric designs across her limbs and torso, exact lines and angles resembling mathematical diagrams etched into flesh. When Robert Fletcher tried to approach, Margaret's head jerked up abruptly. Her eyes, once lively with intelligence, were now blank and peculiar, as if seeing something beyond the forest clearing. She started speaking faster, her voice rising. "The doctor requires compliance. The measurements must be exact. The subject will remain still during the procedure. The copper instruments must be heated to the proper temperature." The hunters covered her with James's coat and brought her back to the settlement, where Dr. Hartwell was called at once. What he observed upon examining Margaret Hayes in his clinic would question all his beliefs regarding medicine, humanity, and the boundaries of scientific exploration. Dr. Samuel Hartwell had been a medical practitioner for more than 20 years, first in Philadelphia, then on the Ohio frontier. He had treated combat injuries, birthed children in rustic cabins, and identified illnesses unnamed in the medical literature of his day. Yet nothing in his career prepared him for the systematic horror he found when he examined Margaret Hayes. The geometric scars covering her body were not accidental injuries or random cuts. They were intentional, exact incisions made using surgical tools. Every cut was uniformly deep, about 1/8 of an inch, and they formed designs that seemed to align with anatomical features. Lines extended from specific spots on her shoulders, arms, and legs, forming what resembled a chart of her muscular and nervous systems. Dr. Hartwell's initial inspection found 17 distinct scar patterns, each made of multiple incisions performed at various times. The accuracy was astonishing. Whoever was responsible had extensive anatomical knowledge and significant surgical skill. The scars had healed well, implying that appropriate medical attention was given during recovery. But it was Margaret's behavior that truly alarmed the doctor. She would sit completely still for extended periods, her gaze empty, then suddenly start speaking in the same robotic voice the hunters had described. She detailed procedures with clinical specificity, calling herself the subject in the third person and discussing various tests and measurements performed on her body. The subject's response to electrical stimulus was recorded on day 47. She would state, her voice entirely emotionless, the copper probes inserted at precise locations along the spinal column. The subject's verbal responses indicate heightened sensitivity in the lower lumbar region. The doctor was pleased with the results and authorized continuation of the experiment. Dr. Hartwell attempted multiple treatments, laudanum for calm, gentle questioning to learn what happened, even hypnosis methods he had learned in Philadelphia. Nothing penetrated whatever wall separated Margaret's awareness from the external world. She would answer direct questions about basic needs like food, water, or warmth. But any query about her missing 3 months would trigger another recitation of clinical notes. The most distressing part of her state was how she would sometimes call him doctor and seemed to expect him to proceed with whatever had been done to her. She would arrange herself in specific postures, lying on her side with arms outstretched, or sitting upright with her head at certain angles, and wait for him to act. When he didn't respond as expected, she would grow restless and repeat phrases about protocol and the need to continue the work. After 3 days of observation, Dr. Hartwell reached a conclusion that shook him profoundly. Margaret Hayes had been the victim of systematic medical testing by someone with extensive expertise. The scars, her demeanor, and the technical language she used all indicated a prolonged period of mistreatment masked as scientific study. But who could have performed this? And why had Margaret apparently cooperated with procedures that must have caused her immense pain and psychological harm? The answers to these questions would be more terrifying than Dr. Hartwell could have imagined, and would finally lead him to a decision that would burden him forever. Dr. Hartwell's inquiry into Margaret's condition started with a meticulous inspection of her belongings, which had been located scattered in the forest near where she was found. Her journal, missing since she disappeared, was discovered stuck between 2 fallen logs, about 50 yards from the clearing. The leather cover was water-stained, and many pages were illegible, but enough was readable to offer alarming insights into her final weeks before vanishing. The early entries were characteristic of Margaret's writing. Detailed notes on farm life, weather, and letters to family in Pennsylvania. But starting in late June, her penmanship began to change. The typically neat writing became increasingly irregular, with words scribbled out and rewritten. The content also shifted, focusing obsessively on medical subjects and scientific processes. June 28, 1823. Dr. Hartwell's medical texts describe the use of electrical apparatus in treating nervous disorders. The principle seems sound. If electricity can animate a frog's legs, as demonstrated by the Italian physician Galvani, surely it might restore proper function to damaged nerves in living subjects. I have been reading about the experiments conducted in Philadelphia and Boston. The results are most promising. July 1, 1823. I have been invited to observe advanced medical procedures. The opportunity to witness true scientific inquiry is rare in a place like Millfield. I have been assured that my education and intelligence make me suitable for participation in important research. Father need not know of these visits. He would not understand the significance of the work being conducted. The last readable entry was dated July 12th, just 3 days before she disappeared. The preliminary examinations are complete. I have been selected as ideal for the advanced procedures. The doctor explains that pain is temporary, but scientific knowledge is eternal. I understand the importance of the work and give my consent freely. The sessions will begin tomorrow. Dr. Hartwell read these entries with escalating dread. Margaret's mentions of the doctor and advanced procedures clearly showed she had been interacting with another physician, someone who had persuaded her to take part in what she thought was legitimate medical study. But who was this mysterious doctor, and where had these sessions occurred? The answer emerged from a surprising place. While inspecting Margaret's clothing, found in various spots in the forest, Dr. Hartwell found a small piece of paper sewn into her dress's lining. It was a partial letter in unfamiliar handwriting containing instructions for a medical process. Asterisk. Subject must be secured using the leather restraints to prevent movement during the application of electrical current. The copper probes should be inserted at depths of no more than 1/4 inch to avoid permanent damage to the nervous system. Duration of each session should not exceed 30 minutes, and the subject must be given adequate time to recover between applications. Asterisk. The emotionless tone of the language was alarming, but what troubled Dr. Hartwell most was the paper itself. It was high-quality writing paper, used by affluent professionals, not the coarse kind typically found on the frontier. The ink was also superior, suggesting the author had access to costly materials and likely substantial wealth. Dr. Hartwell started making discreet inquiries in other settlements in the area. Had anyone seen Margaret during her absence? Had any traveling doctors been in the vicinity? Were there reports of strange activities or strangers? The answers were mostly negative, but one detail stood out. Samuel Brennan, the Irish immigrant, living nearest to the Hayes farm, mentioned seeing lights at the old Westfield property over the summer. The Westfield place was an abandoned farm about 5 miles north of Millfield. Vacant since the owner died of fever in 1821, the property included a substantial log house and several outbuildings, all slowly decaying for 2 years. I thought it might be squatters, Brennan explained, but the lights were too regular. Always in the same window of the main house, and always at the same time of night around 10 o'clock. It went on for weeks, maybe 2 months. Then it stopped suddenly. Sometime in early October, Dr. Hartwell decided to investigate the Westfield property himself. Despite a mounting sense of apprehension that had grown since Margaret's return, what he found there would confirm his worst fears and force him to face the possibility that someone in their small community was capable of monstrous acts in the name of science. The Westfield property was situated in a natural hollow surrounded by hills, hidden from the main road, and reachable only by a narrow path through dense woodland. As Dr. Hartwell approached the abandoned farm on the morning of October 30th, 1823, he was struck by its seclusion. Someone could do anything here without fear of discovery. The main house was a large log structure built with greater care and expense than most frontier homes. The original owner, Jonathan Westfield, had been a successful merchant who invested heavily in land before his early death. The house had glass windows, a luxury on the frontier, and a stone chimney, indicating the owner planned to live comfortably. Dr. Hartwell's first clue that the property had been recently used was the front door, which should have been barred, but was slightly open. The hinges had been recently oiled, and the door opened silently. Inside, the main room showed obvious signs of recent use. The wooden floors were clean, and the air held a faint smell of lamp oil, but what he found in the back room made his blood run cold. The space had been turned into what could only be a Crude medical laboratory. A large wooden table stood in the center, its surface darkened with what looked like blood. Leather restraints were fastened to the table at points matching a human body: wrists, ankles, waist, and neck. The restraints showed heavy wear, suggesting they had been used on someone who struggled. Along the walls, Dr. Hartwell found an assortment of medical tools that were both familiar and alarming. There were surgical knives of various sizes, all clean and well kept. A set of copper probes connected by wires to a primitive electrical device powered by glass jars filled with metal plates of voltaic pile, like those used in university experiments. Most disturbing was a collection of detailed drawings pinned to the wall above the table. They were anatomical sketches of a female body marked with exact measurements and notes. The drawings matched the scar patterns on Margaret's body perfectly. Every incision had been planned and recorded with scientific accuracy. A leather-bound journal lay open on a smaller table by the window. Dr. Hartwell opened it with shaking hands and found page after page of clinical observations in the same handwriting as the paper in Margaret's dress. The entries were dated and detailed, describing experiments on Subject M over nearly 3 months. Day 1. Subject M has been prepared for the initial procedure. Baseline measurements taken. Subject shows excellent physical condition and high intelligence, making her ideal for the planned experiments. Initial incisions made along the predetermined anatomical landmarks. Subject remained conscious throughout the procedure as planned. Reactions recorded. Day 15. Electrical stimulation experiments commenced. Subject EMS responses to varying degrees of current applied to different nerve clusters. The copper probes prove most effective when heated to approximately 120 Fahrenheit. Subject's verbal responses indicate precise locations of maximum sensitivity. Day 32. Subject M has begun to show signs of psychological adaptation to the procedures. She no longer resists the restraints and has begun to assist in positioning herself for each session. This cooperation will allow for more precise measurements and extended experimental periods. Dr. Hartwell could not continue reading. The clinical detachment describing these horrors was almost as disturbing as the procedures themselves. But one detail in the journal caught his attention. The handwriting was not just familiar and seemed to match writing he had seen before. As he studied the journal more carefully, comparing it to medical notes in his own bag, a dreadful understanding formed. The handwriting, the medical terms, the sophisticated knowledge of anatomy and experimentation pointed to someone with extensive medical training, access to advanced equipment, and supplies. The truth struck him physically. He knew this handwriting because he had seen it many times before in medical correspondence and professional journals. The person who had performed these experiments on Margaret Hayes was Dr. Elias Cunningham, the most esteemed physician in southeastern Ohio, a man trained at Harvard Medical School who had been researching nervous system disorders for over a decade. Just when we believed we had heard everything, the horror of Margaret's case deepens. If this story is chilling you, share this video with a friend who enjoys dark mysteries. Click like to support our content, and remember to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's find out together what occurs next in this investigation that would rattle the foundations of medical ethics in frontier America. Dr. Elias Cunningham lived in Athens, the county seat, in a sizable brick house that functioned as both his home and practice. He was 58 years old, a Harvard-trained doctor who had moved to Ohio in 1815 with the declared intention of advancing medical knowledge through research on nervous system disorders. His reputation was flawless. He had treated governors, judges, and wealthy merchants across the region, and his medical advice was sought by doctors as far as Cincinnati and Columbus. Dr. Hartwell's trip to Athens on November 2, 1823, was the hardest of his life. He carried Margaret's journal, the clinical notes from the Westfield property, and a growing conviction that he was about to confront one of the most horrific betrayals of medical ethics in American history. but he also carried haunting questions. How had Cunningham persuaded Margaret to participate? How had he access to the Westfield property? And most importantly, were there other victims? The brick house on Main Street projected an image of respectable prosperity. Heavy curtains hung in the windows, and a brass plaque by the door read Dr. E. Cunningham, M.D., Harvard Medical College. Dr. Hartwell had visited many times for professional consultations, but today he felt he was entering the domain of a stranger, or worse, a monster disguised as a healer. Cunningham received him in his private study, a room Dr. Hartwell had always admired for its impressive medical library and anatomical specimens. Now, looking at the jars of preserved organs and anatomical charts, he wondered how many specimens came from Cunningham's research subjects. When Dr. Hartwell placed the journal and clinical notes on Cunningham's mahogany desk, the older doctor's reaction was revealing. He showed no surprise, shock, or outrage, just examined the evidence with the clinical detachment of studying an interesting specimen. I wondered when someone would discover the Westfield facility, Cunningham said, calmly, leaning back in his leather chair. I had hoped to complete my current series of experiments before relocating to a more secure location. The casual admission struck Dr. Hartwell physically. Current series. Dear God, Cunningham, are you saying there are others? Cunningham reached into his desk and took out a leather portfolio containing detailed sketches. Each drawing showed a different person, men and women of various ages, with the same precise anatomical markings found on Margaret. Names were written below each sketch. Subject A, James Patterson, age 24. Subject C, Sarah Mills, age 19. Subject F, Thomas Burke, age 31. You cannot possibly understand the significance of what I've accomplished, Cunningham said, like a professor addressing a slow student. For centuries, medical science has been hampered by ethical constraints that prevent us from conducting the kind of research necessary to advance human knowledge. I have broken through those barriers. These are people, Cunningham, Dr. Hartwell said. Human beings with families, lives, and futures that you destroyed in the name of your research. Subjects, Cunningham corrected firmly, carefully. Selected subjects who contributed to the advancement of medical science. Their sacrifice will benefit thousands of future patients who will receive treatment based on the knowledge gained through my research. Dr. Hartwell demanded to know how Cunningham had convinced Margaret to participate. The answer revealed a manipulation so calculated and cruel it seemed beyond human comprehension. Cunningham explained he had developed a systematic method for identifying and recruiting subjects. He traveled through remote settlements of southeastern Ohio, ostensibly providing medical care, but actually finding potential subjects, young people who were intelligent, healthy, and, crucially, socially isolated. Margaret Hayes was ideal, Cunningham said, pulling out a separate file with detailed notes on her background. Highly intelligent, curious about medical science, living with only her father in a remote location. I began cultivating her interest during my visits to treat her father's injury. I brought her medical texts to read, discussed cases with her, praised her understanding of complex concepts. She was hungry for intellectual stimulation and grateful for my attention. The psychological seduction had been gradual and sophisticated. Cunningham had convinced Margaret she was uniquely qualified to assist in groundbreaking research. He had showed her letters supposedly from prominent physicians in Boston and Philadelphia, praising his work and stressing the importance of finding suitable assistants. He had even forged endorsements from medical institutions, creating a fictional network of support for his experiments. I told her that the research required absolute secrecy because of the conservative attitudes of frontier communities toward advanced medical procedures. Cunningham continued. She believed she was participating in work that would eventually be published in the most prestigious medical journals in America. She was proud to be selected for such important research. Dr. Hartwell felt ill realizing the full extent of Cunningham's manipulation, and the others. How many others have there been? Cunningham consulted a separate journal, tracing a list of names and dates. Margaret was subject G, the 7th in my current research series. The previous subjects provided valuable data, but they lacked her intelligence and resilience. Most expired during the more advanced procedures before I could complete the full experimental protocol. The casual discussion of 6 human deaths was perhaps the most chilling part. Cunningham showed no remorse, no recognition of wrongdoing. In his mind, he was a pioneering researcher, brave enough to push past ethical limits. "Where are they buried?" Dr. Hartwell asked, his voice a whisper. "Disposed of in remote locations where they will never be discovered," Cunningham replied. "The forest is vast, and there are many deep ravines and abandoned mine shafts in this region. Their remains serve no further purpose for my research." Dr. Hartwell stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "Your research ends now, Cunningham. I have documented evidence of your crimes, and I intend to present it to the State Attorney General. You will face justice for what you have done." Cunningham's reaction was swift and decisive. His manner shifted from clinical detachment to cold menace. "You will do nothing," he said, moving to a cabinet holding his medical instruments. "I have spent too many years developing this research to allow a frontier physician with limited understanding to destroy it. I have influential friends throughout this region," Cunningham continued, taking a surgical knife from the cabinet. "Judges, prosecutors, wealthy merchants who depend on my medical expertise. Who do you think will be believed? A respected, Harvard-trained physician conducting important research, or a country doctor making wild accusations based on the ravings of a mentally disturbed woman?" Cunningham advanced toward Dr. Hartwell, the surgical knife held with the expert grip of frequent use. Margaret Hayes was found wandering in the forest, clearly insane. Any scars on her body can be explained as self-inflicted wounds caused by her mental condition. There is no credible evidence of any crime, and there never will be. But Dr. Hartwell had anticipated this. Before coming to Athens, he had prepared for the possibility that Cunningham would try to silence him. Hidden around Millfield were copies of the evidence and detailed letters describing his discoveries. If he failed to return by a certain date, those documents would be sent to authorities in Columbus. "I've prepared for this conversation, Cunningham," Dr. Hartwell said, moving toward the door while watching the knife. "If anything happens to me, multiple copies of your research notes and journal entries will be delivered to the governor, the State Attorney General, and several newspaper editors. Your crimes will be exposed regardless of your connections." Cunningham paused, his expression shifting as he calculated the implications. For the first time, Dr. Hartwell saw uncertainty in his eyes. "You're bluffing," Cunningham said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Dr. Hartwell replied. "Are you willing to stake your reputation and your freedom on that assumption?" The confrontation climaxed when Cunningham, apparently deciding he had no choice but to eliminate the threat, lunged forward with the surgical knife. Dr. Hartwell, who had served as a military surgeon in the War of 1812, had reflexes sharp enough to avoid the initial thrust. The two men struggled in the confined study, knocking over chairs and scattering medical instruments. Cunningham was older but desperate. Dr. Hartwell was driven by a righteous fury that gave him unusual strength. The struggle was brief but violent, ending when Cunningham lost his footing and fell backward onto his desk, the surgical knife turning in his hand and piercing his chest. Dr. Hartwell watched in stunned silence as life left Cunningham's eyes. The man who had tortured and killed at least 7 innocent people died with the same clinical detachment he had shown in his experiments. His final words, a complaint about the interruption of important research. In the immediate aftermath, Dr. Hartwell faced a decision that would haunt him forever. He could report the truth that he had killed Cunningham in self-defense while confronting him, about his crimes, but doing so would require exposing the full horror of the experiments, further traumatizing Margaret and potentially destroying public trust in medicine throughout the region. Instead, Dr. Hartwell chose a more complex path. He arranged the scene to suggest Cunningham had died in an accident during a medical procedure. The official investigation by Athens County Sheriff Robert Mason was perfunctory. Cunningham was widely respected. Dr. Hartwell's account was accepted, without question. And no one looked deeper. Dr. Hartwell used the hours after Cunningham's death to systematically destroy the evidence. He burned the research notes, anatomical sketches, and experiment records. The surgical instruments were thrown into the deepest part of the Hocking River, and the electrical apparatus was dismantled and scattered across county dumps. The Westfield property received similar treatment, under cover of darkness. Dr. Hartwell and two trusted friends, who asked no questions but helped without hesitation, removed every piece of equipment from the makeshift lab. The restraint table was chopped up and burned. The medical instruments were buried in separate locations, and the room was thoroughly cleaned to remove all traces. But Dr. Hartwell could not destroy the most important evidence: Margaret Hayes herself. Her condition remained a constant reminder of Cunningham's crimes, and her care became Dr. Hartwell's primary responsibility and his ongoing penance for not stopping the experiments. Sooner, Margaret's recovery was gradual and incomplete. The systematic torture had left permanent physical and psychological scars that no contemporary treatment could fully heal. For weeks after Cunningham's death, she continued having episodes where she lapsed into mechanical speech, reciting clinical observations in that flat, emotionless voice. The subject's response to stimulus was recorded, she would say, staring blankly. The measurements were precise. The doctor was pleased with the progress. The sessions will continue tomorrow. During these episodes, Margaret seemed completely unaware of her surroundings, lost in memories of the procedures. Dr. Hartwell tried various treatments, herbal remedies, gentle conversation, even experimental approaches from journals, but nothing broke through the psychological barriers Cunningham's abuse had built. Gradually, however, Margaret began to improve. The episodes became less frequent and shorter. She started recognizing Dr. Hartwell and other familiar faces, and occasionally spoke in her own voice about immediate needs, like hunger or cold. But the bright intelligence that had made her a target for Cunningham never fully returned. Dr. Hartwell arranged for Margaret's long-term care through a network of Quaker families in Pennsylvania who specialized in mental disturbances. He corresponded with Philadelphia colleagues experienced in treating similar conditions, though he could never fully explain Margaret's trauma without revealing Cunningham's crimes. The financial burden of Margaret's care fell entirely on Dr. Hartwell. He sold his medical practice in Millfield and used the proceeds to establish a trust fund for her lifelong needs. He moved to a smaller farm outside the settlement, living quietly and practicing medicine limitedly, never charging families who couldn't pay. Thomas Hayes never learned the truth about his daughter. Dr. Hartwell told him only that Margaret had suffered a mental breakdown from her experiences while lost in the forest and required permanent care in a specialized facility. Thomas accepted this explanation, perhaps because the alternative, that his daughter had been systematically tortured by a respected physician, was too horrible to consider. Thomas died in 1825, 2 years after Margaret's disappearance, never recovering from the combined trauma of her ordeal and his own guilt. His final words, according to a neighbor at his deathbed, were an apology to Margaret for failing to protect her. The Hayes farm was abandoned after Thomas's death and eventually reverted to the state. New settlers bought the property in 1828, unaware of its tragic history. The house was torn down and rebuilt, and the land was cleared for different crops, erasing most physical traces of the family. Dr. Hartwell visited Margaret regularly during the 15 years between Cunningham's death and his own passing and 1838. These visits were both a comfort and a reminder of his failure to prevent her suffering. Margaret seemed to recognize him and would often calm in his presence. But she never spoke about her experiences in 1823. The Quaker family caring for Margaret reported that she lived peacefully, helping with simple tasks and occasionally showing flashes of her former intelligence when discussing books or everyday topics. But she never married, never formed close relationships, and never fully escaped the psychological prison of Cunningham's experiments. Dr. Hartwell's private papers, found after his death, revealed the full weight of his burden. In a letter written shortly before his death, he described his decision to cover up Cunningham's crimes as the most difficult choice of my life, but perhaps the only one that could prevent further suffering. I have saved one life, he wrote, but I failed to save 6 others. The weight of that failure will follow me to my grave. I pray that history will judge me not for my silence about these crimes, but for my efforts to ensure that they never happen again. Dr. Hartwell's medical bag and instruments were found in his attic after his death, wrapped in cloth and stored in a trunk with a handwritten note. Some tools of healing become instruments of remembrance for what we could not prevent. May those who find these understand that medicine is a sacred trust that must never be betrayed. The 3 doctors who had refused to treat Margaret Hayes, Dr. Hartwell himself, Dr. Marcus Webb from Athens, and Dr. Joseph Sterling from Lancaster had all recognized her condition resulted from systematic abuse, but they also understood the practical impossibility of seeking justice through conventional means. In Frontier, Ohio, their refusal to treat her was not abandonment, but a recognition that conventional medicine could not address trauma of such magnitude. In the decades following Margaret's case, Dr. Hartwell became increasingly reclusive and eventually stopped practicing medicine altogether. He sold his remaining medical equipment in 1830 and devoted himself to farming and caring for animals. Neighbors described him as a sad but kind man who would provide medical care in emergencies, but seemed haunted by an unspoken tragedy. The story of Margaret Hayes and Dr. Cunningham's crimes remained buried for nearly 2 centuries. The official records were sealed by court order, and the few who knew the truth took their knowledge to their graves. It was only in the 1990s, when Athens County Courthouse records were being digitized, that a researcher discovered the anomalous file containing Dr. Hartwell's sealed report about unusual medical circumstances requiring confidential handling. This led to a limited investigation that uncovered fragments of the story, enough to piece together basic facts, but not enough to provide complete answers about the scope of Cunningham's crimes or the fate of his other victims. Archaeological surveys of the Westfield property and surrounding areas have never located human remains, suggesting Cunningham was thorough in disposing of evidence. Margaret Hayes lived until 1847, dying peacefully at 46 in the Quaker household that had cared for her for over 20 years. Her death was recorded simply as natural causes following a long illness, with no mention of the trauma that shaped her adult life. She was buried in a small cemetery outside Philadelphia, her gravestone bearing only her name and dates. The case of Margaret Hayes represents one of the darkest chapters in American medical history, a reminder that the isolation and lack of oversight on the frontier could create opportunities for those who would exploit the vulnerable in the name of scientific progress. It also shows the terrible burden carried by those who discovered such crimes but were powerless to seek justice through conventional means. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that Margaret Hayes may not have been unique. The vast, sparsely populated wilderness of early 19th century America provided countless opportunities for those who would prey upon the isolated and defenseless. How many other victims were there, scattered across the frontier, their suffering known only to their tormentors, and perhaps a few witnesses who chose silence over the futility of seeking justice. The official records of Margaret Hayes' case remain sealed in the Athens County Courthouse, accessible only to researchers with legitimate academic interest in early American medical history. Dr. Hartwell's letter to the state Attorney General was never sent, and the copies of Cunningham's journal he claimed to have made were never found among his possessions. This mystery shows us the terrifying reality that sometimes the most evil acts are committed by those society trusts, most those who take sacred oaths to do no harm but hide behind respectability and professional authority to commit unspeakable crimes. It reminds us that the price of scientific progress should never include the suffering of the innocent, and that those who pursue knowledge at any cost must be held accountable. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Could there have been other victims whose stories were never told, scattered across the remote settlements of early America? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in medical history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark mysteries from America's past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries that reveal the hidden horrors of our nation's early years. See you in the next video.